Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. Doug Maurice, Nathan Baird. Rapid fire. We're running through some things that we've said before, and people have reacted,
Buckeye
so
Talk.
we're reacting. Yes, there's only so many things that a person can say, and there's only so many things that a person can say.
12 months a year.
We have some Jim Knowles things here, Nathan, that I want us to dive into, and there are some astute points being made, and I think it's in the continuation of all of us in the media, in the fan base, trying to still get a handle on Jim Knowles and what he is and how this defense works when it's maximized. And do you feel like you have that handle yet? Every time we get a piece of information that Jim Knowles, I scream and I shout and I say, "No, I get it." And I never completely get it, but I get it more. How good of a sense do you feel like you have of what Jim Knowles wants to do and how well you think Ohio State will be able to do it this season?
I mean, I think in general, I have that grasp. I think there are some ways, though, and the conversation we had with Jim Knowles a couple weeks ago was illuminating because it's clear that his own understanding of not what he is and what his system is and what, in theory, he can do, but what he wants to / should do with Ohio State are still evolving. And he mentioned this on a number of occasions. I actually am in the middle of writing something about Mitchell Melton as we record this, and that may already actually be up on the site by the time people read this. And that's another example of so we went into talking about the jack and how much they used it at Oklahoma State, but then they barely used it at all here. But they want to use it more in the future, and there are still some parts of that are evolving as he figures out exactly what works best with Ohio State's personnel. And I think there's some of that is going to probably still continue adjusting year to year. But I think in general, I do think I have a grasp of him wanting to be aggressive, him wanting to put pressure on opposing offenses, opposing offensive coordinators, opposing quarterbacks. I mean, he said that, but more than saying it, you saw it on the field, how aggressive they were at times, to some people's estimation, overly aggressive at times. And there are probably some adjustments to be made there, but I think that's maybe the hallmark of it, that you're attacking with guys. This was not a defense that when this defense was at its best, and it was at its best in long stretches last year. I thought it played well in long stretches last year. It was a defense that was coming at you with intent and intensity. And I think that's what he wants to keep growing here. It's just a matter of fixing some things from a skill standpoint, coaching some positions up, and also just getting the right guys in place.
We have recorded and not yet released a Retalkables on the 2016 Ohio State-Michigan game that I thought was fun. I thought it was illuminating. That'll be coming your way, everybody, sometime, we believe, next week. And we learned a lot about Ohio State's defense by rewatching that game with the superstars on that Ohio State defense. And I will tell you, there is a particular thing that's happening here. And I don't mean to drop a Chris Holtmann comparison because everyone's going to turn off their podcast because it's like, oh, it's basketball again. It's not basketball, but it is a comparison that I'm always curious about when a coach elevates to Ohio State, because often what a coach did is have great success at his previous stop with less talent. Chris Holtmann at Butler, Jim Knowles at Oklahoma State. So then the instinct is, well, if they were that successful with less talent, wait till they get to Ohio State and they have the opportunity to coach more talent or to recruit more talent. And then I think you find out, okay, does everything get amplified? Hey, this dude is a dude as a coach, and give him better players and he's a better coach? Or is there something about that coach, Nathan, that he actually fit better at that level, at sort of that tier down, not at an underdog level, but at a place where you weren't getting all the 5 stars and you were trying to, turn good players into great players and maybe have players who fit specific roles but couldn't do everything. They were a little short. They were a step slow. They were a great defender, but they couldn't shoot. They were a great tackler, but they couldn't run, like all those kind of things. And I don't know, Nathan, that you can know until the coach gets to the next place. And I still am a little in between on Jim Knowles on this question. And there are two questions here from texters that'll lead us down this path more. This is from the 518. This is about the Knowles defense. I watch a lot of European soccer, and in that sports context, there is way more pundit discussion than there is in American football about whether certain players are a fit for their manager's system. Over there, it's less about whether players are good or bad, but rather under what managers would they thrive. Over here, all I hear is 5-star, 4-star, whatever. I think Tommy Eichenberg is the perfect example of someone who, in a universal sense, is a decent player, but under Knowles thrives. I wonder if in the future Ohio State should pursue more 4-star players to fit this style of defense rather than always pursuing the universally good 5-stars. In a certain sense, I feel like Michigan is better at this than Ohio State in terms of system fit. So let me ask what I think is a companion question, perhaps from the other side. This one is from March, but I've been saving it because it was a Ted Lasso, Jim Knowles thing. And I don't want to have a huge Ted Lasso discussion here. My God, and I can't even remember. It's like Ted Lasso. Whenever Ted Lasso actually tried to do sports stuff, I felt they were like, sports is good. And it's like, okay, sports good. It's like, this is just stick to the part about like, let's all be friends. From the 614, my gut feeling about this defense and the Knowles hire is getting stronger. It's dumb, but hear me out. Our best defense in recent years was under Jeff Hafley, who, in my opinion, simplified everything and attacked. I wanted the Knowles hire to be a slam dunk, but I always felt like it might be just a bit too cute for the Big Ten and for our personnel. Then last week, watching Ted Lasso, there was a part where Roy told Ted they were going to keep their scheme simple because they were less talented and it's what they grew up playing. So it's instinctual. This made my gut feeling stronger that the defense is going to continue to struggle against good teams due to style and personnel. Perhaps it's time to embrace Ted Lasso and employ the Michael Scott keep it simple, stupid strategy. It's dumb, I know, but it's my rant. Thanks for listening. Okay, so I feel like we're coming at that sort of from opposite sides here, Nathan. Here's my overall view is you either need great talent and then you keep it simple and let the great talent get after it, or you need a little more something to the scheme because the talent alone isn't enough. When it's Chase Young and Jeff Okudah and Pete Werner and Davon Hamilton and guys like that in 2019, and it's what they did before that. You play man coverage, you play a 4-man front, you have defensive ends who can get after the passer, and you have corners who can cover. And it is simple. But if you don't have the Bosa's or Chase Young or Jeff Okudah or Denzel Ward, all of a sudden, that's not enough. So Ohio State, I think, hit that reality in 20 and 21 of like, okay, I don't know, this isn't enough. So they brought in a schemer. And so now the idea of keeping it simple with Jim Knowles, to me, would run contrary to what you brought him here for, because you're asking him to elevate what was a not good enough defense. So this whole thing about, and this goes back to the Butler, Oklahoma State kind of thing. Jim Knowles has always elevated with his scheme. There was never enough talent, and I have some numbers about Oklahoma State. There was never enough just talent at Duke or Oklahoma State, Nathan, for that defense to be good just on talent. Those defenses were good because of Jim Knowles. Ohio State often can be good, not just on talent, but talent first. That I don't know that people are like, oh, the scheme at Ohio State. I'm like, it's like, no, it's Cameron Hayward, and it's Bradley Roby, and it's Darren Lee, and it's like through the years. So now we reach this point, and we've had these discussions all along the way, Nathan. We believe the Ohio State defensive personnel, the talent does need to be better. But I don't know that simplifying Jim Knowles is the way to go. I think it's more everybody learning what he does through experience, through reps, through another season of it. But I don't, if you want simple, I wouldn't have gotten Jim Knowles to begin with. So that's a lot of me talking. What do you think about this whole personnel scheme marriage between Knowles and Ohio State?
That's a lot of me talking, Buckeye talk. We're hitting a
Yeah.
lot of those early on today. We had a meeting today. We had a meeting earlier today about something, and Doug, it was me and some other people talking for a large portion of it. And Doug introduced himself to the meeting by saying, like, "We've had this meeting for 21 minutes and I haven't talked yet. My head's gonna explode." So that's the same
I
energy
could
that we get
feel
right
it.
here on Buckeye Talk.
It was visceral. I mean, like I felt like I was going to be ill.
It was funny. It was kind of funny watching you for those 21 minutes or whatever it was, because I could tell that you were very antsy. But to get back to the question, um, I'm having a hard time drawing sweeping conclusions from what we saw from Jim Knowles last year. I think it was an introduction to him. I think he also was introduced to all of this, and I think that it can be a little bit. We got to be careful not to make too much of some small sample sizes on some things too, um, as it relates to, well, because you mentioned that 2016 retalkables we just did. One of the conclusions we came to the end of that retalkables was, how many of these guys would you take before you took ahead of anybody on the 2022 Ohio State defense? And I think the answer was 11. Like, I think we would take 11 defensive players, and that's not a shot at the 2022 defense, really. It's how good that defense was. Well, let me ask that question to you again. How many players from the 2019 defense would you take ahead of anybody from the 2022 defense? It's
Oh,
a
yeah.
couple
I
few at
mean,
least.
6, 8.
So,
Yeah.
right. And now there's some guys who are about to go into their third year who are hitting their peaks, who are maybe going to change
Right.
that answer. So I'm saying that up front. JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, Denzel Burke, we might have some different answers in a few months. But my point being that I think it is still fair to wonder if they haven't hit the sweet spot yet since 2019 between scheme that they trust, and then most importantly that the players trust, and the talent being at the right maturity level, the football maturity level. You know what I'm saying? Now I do think though we saw some other signs last year of, early on this season you could feel something different out of this defense, and that's why I mentioned that the trust that the players had in it, because I think that this defensive group trusts Jim Knowles and trusts this defense more than what was being put out there the 2 years prior to that. Just things that they have said, they found that difficult to play in. Things that we've heard from other people, that there was a lot of sort of second guessing of that they didn't necessarily have a lot of confidence that the scheme and the plan was going to work. And I think we saw a change in that last year. I think you saw a more confident team out on the field, and that's why Tommy Eichenberg played the way he did, and Steel Chambers played the way he did, the defensive line played the way it did. And a lot of the problems that they had last year were kind of concentrated in the secondary, and even more so the cornerbacks in front of that. So I've strayed from, I think, the actual question you answered, but I think it's still I think that is still the way I said it before is, I guess, maybe where I'm looking, that I think there is another year of Jim Knowles' scheme that has to be implemented here, or has been implemented, and they're going to feel more fluid in that this year. And I think there's also a year of maturity that needed to happen at some key positions, who are, regardless of who was coordinating the defense, to get the most out of it.
I was sort of wondering about this from the minute he got here. And it was particularly related like to the jack position when we were learning about it with Jim Knowles. And it's like, what if you have Chase Young? Like, what do you do? Are you putting Chase Young at the jack, or are you just letting Chase Young be Chase Young? And he said right when he got here, well, I let Chase Young be Chase Young. But then he took a 5-star in Jack Sawyer and tried to turn him into the jack, and it didn't work. So I think ideally you wind up with the best of both worlds here, which is we have a scheme, but if we have first rounders all over the place, we don't have to get too fancy. We'll let the first rounders play like first rounders and let it rip. But when we don't, we have a scheme that keeps offensive coordinators and quarterbacks off balance. Our safeties are moving. We have a guy who can move around the line of scrimmage, and you don't know where he's coming from. And that might create pressure. We'll have more, maybe exotic blitz opportunities and that kind of thing. And I do think in the end, it's like, well, how could it be bad? How could having more good players be bad? It shouldn't be.
Right.
But I do think you don't want to get in the way of your good players. But I think what Ohio State, well, it's like Ohio State was desperate. Ohio State desperately needed to fix its defense. And you could have tried to recruit your way out of that. And not that you were going to keep Matt Barnes as the full-time defensive coordinator for another year, but you didn't have to get the $2 million a year guy. Maybe you just got a defensive coordinator and you just told everybody to hit the recruiting trail, hit the transfer portal, try to bring in a bunch of 5 stars and fix it that way. But I feel like that's not, of course they want to recruit at a high level, but they aren't necessarily, we had this conversation about Jim Knowles. Jim Knowles is not a great recruiter. So you didn't pick that. Right? You could have picked, let's have 5 defensive coaches. We'll have co-coordinators. We're going to recruit our tails off. Somebody's in charge of the front. Somebody's in charge of the back 7. We'll pair it up. Ryan Day has an overall defensive philosophy, but we're going to get there on talent. That would have been a reasonable approach. That's not what they picked. They picked a schemer whose recruiting isn't his strength. So they've made their choice, Nathan. So they pick scheme.
Yeah.
But does that mean you can't have great players in that scheme? I mean, I think ideally, but I don't think it's simple. I don't think it's keep it simple stupid. I think it's learn the defense stupid. Like you wouldn't call somebody stupid at the end of that, but you would say experience matters. And if we're saying year 2 should be better than year 1, I think a defense that has a certain style and scheme to it, it makes sense that would be the case.
So let's talk more about the Jack, because I feel like it exemplifies a lot of epitomizes a lot of things about this conversation. So back in the spring, he came out and alluded to, maybe what we did with Jack Sawyer probably wasn't the best, and we're probably going to not do much Jack this spring. We're really going to kind of hold off on that. We really want to see what Mitchell Melton's going to do there, because that's a guy that he pinpointed last year as a guy who would make sense there, and then he got hurt, and they had to go with. And he's also mentioned C.J. Hicks there, I think, as a way to maybe get C.J. Hicks on the field more, because he knows he's not going to necessarily start the year playing ahead of Steel Chambers. So here's what he said about the Jack a couple weeks ago. By the time I left Oklahoma State, that's practically all we did as far as using the Jack as part of their base defense. But they were different players, different guys. And as we used some of it here, it just wasn't popping. I'm not saying that it wasn't effective, but it wasn't popping, wasn't jumping off. Like when you watch the things at Oklahoma State, you went, wow, that was great. So gradually, I just pulled back on it, because it doesn't matter what I know, it matters what works. And an end to that quote, something about what the players, and it kind of trailed off. I couldn't get on the audio. But I think that is a really interesting look into the way Jim Knowles thinks about things, because I think if you're coming in as a coach, you were just given $2 million to come to Ohio freaking State and coordinate their defense and try to win a national championship. Like, he makes a big deal about how they were one play away from getting into the playoff at Oklahoma State, which is true, but that was kind of like a Cinderella story almost in the 14 playoff situation. And Ohio State, it's that's where the conversation starts. So when you come in like that, it would be natural for me to say, well, I just had this awesome defense last year, and it's been building towards that, and we got great results out of this position, and we've got some great athletes, so let's try to make that work. And it wasn't I don't know that Jack Sawyer played a lot less than he would have by playing the Jack, but it doesn't seem like it doesn't look like it was the right fit. It doesn't look like Jack Sawyer liked it very much, and it didn't really get them great results, as Jim Knowles is saying. It didn't get them exemplary results. So it's a question that I would ask is are we assuming too much, expecting too much, that he would have been able to, Jim Knowles would have been able to look last spring, a year ago spring, and survey the talent and say, well, I just can't use the Jack. That I don't think necessarily makes a lot of sense. And I think just because you tried something and didn't work doesn't mean it wasn't worth trying. I think the important thing is what you did learn from that experience and how that affects how you attack 2023. Because it definitely sounds now like not only do they not want to use Jack Sawyer there, that he realizes that with this collection of talent, that maybe they just don't even need that position, or it's going to be more of a niche than it was when it was a central part of the Oklahoma State defense.
But he has also talked about the ideal Jack as a guy who maybe is a little short at something. Maybe he isn't a perfectly well-rounded defensive player. And then he got here and put a 5-star sophomore in that spot. Well, who is a perfectly well-rounded player. Jack Sawyer doesn't have any deficiencies.
Right. Right.
I think that was a misstep by him then.
Yeah.
I do think so. So
like I said, I don't know that it means that he played a lot less.
here's the thing, and no, but he played less effectively. I think he played less effectively. Don't we think that it didn't work?
It didn't seem like
So
he enjoyed
I do
the
think
fit.
the way he's talked about it now, because the way he's talked about it now is like the guy we said like, oh, they should play Chip Trainum at the Jack. So there's a part. Some of the people, some of our texters really are into CJ Hicks as the Jack. So here's the thing about it depends which way you're coming at this. If CJ Hicks is just not gonna play linebacker, like Steel Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg are the linebackers, and I know you're a 5-star, and I know lots of 5-stars play in year 2, but it's just not gonna happen. Sorry. We're playing veteran linebackers here. Then CJ Hicks as the Jack in a specialized role that's on the field 20 snaps a game is better than nothing, is better than him being a pure backup. I would say I want CJ Hicks to be a starting linebacker or a co-starting linebacker. So I don't want him in the niche role that actually is supposed to be for a guy who's a little short or a little slow or a little stiff or something, because he's not any of those things. He's just a little blocked by Steel Chambers. So if the choice is share that spot with Steel Chambers at the linebacker position that you were actually born to play, I pick that over the Jack specialized role. If that's off the table, then Jack is better than nothing. But I don't think the idea of putting 5-stars in the Jack position now, after a year of it and the way he's talked about it, I don't think that's the way to go. And I think getting 5-stars on the field in year 2 at a place like Ohio State is actually a thing that a defensive coordinator should be very open to. And he just hasn't coached 5-stars before.
Yeah, there's going to be still probably some adjustment to that. And I've been skeptical of the CJ Hicks at the Jack thing from the start for 2 reasons. Number one is just the things he said in the spring about how little they were going to incorporate it. So is it really going to be a thing that they just spring in preseason camp and try to move forward with? I don't think so. But the other thing is, because of what happened with Jack Sawyer last year, they were having very real conversations of, well, is Jack Sawyer far enough along? Is he as far as he's supposed to be as even a defensive end now? Now you need him to just be a defensive end. Did you screw that up? Did you interrupt the development enough? He's going to be less for you than he was this year. And whatever we think of CJ Hicks for 2023, he absolutely is going to be a starting linebacker on this defense in 2024. Like 1,000%, right? So why not? And he might need to be earlier than that this year. Like, guys get hurt sometimes. So like I've been skeptical of how much they would do that with CJ Hicks, especially because they feel like it was such a problem with Jack Sawyer before. And on top of all that, the way Larry Johnson was talking about Mitchell Melton, they held him out in the spring specifically. Mitchell Melton came up to him later and said, well, that was a great idea, coach, because it took a lot of pressure off of him and let him come back at his own speed. And they think he's 100% now, and he'll be back in the mix this fall. So I think if anybody's doing that this fall, I think it's going to be Mitchell Melton. So that would be, I think, what everyone wants, probably CJ Hicks included. I'm speaking for, I'm putting words in his mouth.
If we ever got to the point where Steel Chambers was abducted by aliens for a week and it was like, oh, CJ Hicks is going to start at linebacker, and they were like, well, we're not going to start CJ because he's been doing a lot of Jack in practice, and so he's not, I would throw myself in the Olentangy River.
Right.
That's what I would be like. Okay,
right.
So now what? Now we can't do so. You got to play the best players. This is a related question that, again, I find super interesting from the 614. As you guys were talking about maximizing Tommy Eichenberg and other players on the defense, it occurred to me we've been saying for years that guys in this defense will be better pros than college players. Baron Browning and Pete Werner come to mind. What if these guys start being better college players than pros? Guys like Tommy being All-Americans but mid-round picks. That's what a great defensive schemer should be able to do for you. Also, just don't get in the way of unleashing 5-star talents from the 614. I think this is a really smart text, Nathan. And I will say, I think we have proof of this. The last 2 NFL drafts, we know there were only 2 Ohio State defensive players drafted in the last 2 NFL drafts. Now, a lot of that is because they played so many young guys that Tommy Eichenberg and Lathan Ransom and Denzel Burke and guys who are Tommy Eichenberg staying in school, Steel Chambers staying in school, all those guys, a lot of them just haven't been available for the draft yet. But we still have guys like Tanner McAllister and Cam Brown and Ronnie Hickman and Teron Vincent and guys like that who didn't get drafted. So in the last 2 years, only 2 Ohio State defensive players drafted. Do you know how many Oklahoma State players were taken combined in the last 2 NFL drafts, Nathan?
Not many. Like, I mean, it could be 0.
5.
Really?
5 Oklahoma State defensive players taken in the last
Rodriguez
2
even
NFL
drafted?
drafts. 2. Yeah, he was. He was a
Was he?
6th
Okay.
round pick.
Okay.
3 in 2022 and 2 in 2023. And they were drafted in the 4th, 6th, 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 and 7th rounds.
Yeah, okay.
Here's where those 5 drafted players, where they were ranked in the 247 composite as recruits. 807, 842, 1056, 1202, 1504. None of them were in the top 800 as recruits. All 5 were drafted. Only 1 before the 6th round. And I think if you're drafted in the 6th or 7th round, you're one of 2 things. You're a good athlete who tested well, who did not produce in college, or you're a very productive player who's not a great athlete. And I think these 5 guys would fall into that. Malcolm Rodriguez was a 6th round pick. He got drafted by the Lions. I follow a bunch of Lions writers. They love Malcolm Rodriguez.
Yeah.
So if that's what this is, so then it's like, okay, Jim Knowles is turning guys ranked in the 800s into draft picks. Ohio State had 2 total defensive draft picks. I don't know that they had a single recruit in the 800s. If they were recruiting defensive players in the 800s, the entire fan base would be on fire. So, does that mean Jim Knowles should recruit guys that fit his system, that aren't as highly ranked? That you want Ohio State? Malcolm Rodriguez is an unbelievable college player. He's a recruit in the 1500s. Even Tommy Eichenberg, we're like Tommy Eichenberg. Tommy Eichenberg's like in the 350s. Tommy Eichenberg would have been like the greatest recruit in the history of Oklahoma State football. Is this something, Nathan? Would we actually accept lower rated defensive recruits that Jim Knowles is saying he fits, he's smart, he fits, he plays this way, that's what I need, I can exactly envision him here, boom, I don't care what he's ranked, 2.5 stars? Are you guys are listening to this, is that cool? Are you like this Oklahoma State model, 5 draft picks in 2 years versus 2 draft picks in 2 years? Is there anything to learn here, Nathan?
Well, Jim Knowles certainly didn't show up here and say, like, I can't wait to turn this roster over into a bunch of guys ranked in the 800s or 1000s. You know what I mean? Like, that is not what he came here and said. He said, like, I'm excited to coach this next level of talent. It's a level of talent he has not had before. So I don't think Jim Knowles would tell you that's what he needs to do. But I think what the answer is that it's a combination of both is how you do this. Let's look at that 2019 defense again, because I think it's a great example, because you had the Jeff Okudas and the Chase Youngs, of course. But then you get down to the middle rounds and you start finding guys who were incredibly critical to how good that defense was, whether it's Davon Hamilton and Malik Harrison. Jordan Fuller going in the 6th round is another example of that. Jayshon Cornell in the 7th round is another example of that. And some of those guys were not ranked in 800s, 1000s, but by Ohio State standards, like 6th, 7th round guys. But they were really productive guys. They were incredibly crucial guys. And what you've been missing at Ohio State, I think, for these last few years is, number one, the absence of that elite star power on defense, unquestionably. And then number 2 is that next level of guys have not been hitting either. There's been something too much missing there. It's been short. And the combination of those 2 things has been exposed on the field against the best teams that they play.
So when you bring up Jayshon Cornell, what's your point with Jayshon Cornell?
That it was a mixture of the kind of players that they had. Like I know that he was a higher ranked recruit. I know that he was a guy that
He
right
was a
that wasn't
top
even
100 national recruit who turned into a 7th round pick. That
yeah, but you're still getting. I
like
mean, you're
that's
still
not
getting.
success to me.
I know, but what I'm saying is that those guys were augmented by the fact that they had 3 first-round picks that year, 2 guys in the third round. It's the mix of talent that they had. I mean, they were getting, you know what I'm saying? Like their misses weren't as bad as they've been the last couple of years, and the top end was getting higher than what their top end has been getting the last couple of years. It's been both.
So I will be curious if we get one of these coming down the pike on because sometimes Ohio State recruits a lower rated guy. Like I think Denzel Burke would fit to this. Hartline's like, this guy's a dog, get him in here. He's in the 300s, I don't care. He plays receiver in high school. He's going to be a corner here, and Denzel Burke came in and was ready. But that wasn't like a fit. That was sometimes Ohio State takes guys that they think, well, we know better. Like they don't care what the ratings are,
Hmm.
but there's something here. The idea that they acknowledge that they would look at a group of 10 linebackers and say, okay, like we honestly believe these 7 guys are more physically gifted. But this guy, like the way he plays, like there's something about him, and maybe, you know, he's exactly what Jim wants in this defense. And that they wind up with the guy who's ranked 1,100 in the country, Nathan. But Jim Knowles is saying he's my new Malcolm Rodriguez. He's my new Malcolm Rodriguez. When I watched him on his film, I thought it was Malcolm Rodriguez's high school film. I had to pull it out and compare it because they're like doppelgangers. It looks like a clone of him, and that we would be like, okay, like cool. And there'd be some linebacker who's number 161 in the country being like, Ohio State didn't offer me. I came to camp and they didn't offer me. We're cool, or we think, Jim Knowles, why can't you just take the linebacker ranked 161 instead of 1,100 and then have him do Malcolm Rodriguez things, except he's even more naturally talented?
Well, I think the smarter way for Jim Knowles to do that would be not to sell him that way coming in. I think it would just be Ohio State takes low ranked guys sometimes, often on like the offensive line, I suppose, but once in a while sneak a lower. But I don't think you want to put those expectations on him coming in. I think you recruit the guy, you sign the guy, and then you like Malcolm Rodriguez didn't have to be sold. He sold himself. Like he just became Malcolm Rodriguez. He was one of the best defensive players in the country that year. And even though he was only a 6th round pick, he's also proving himself in the NFL, as you say. So I think that's going to be the key there is whether those guys come in and sell themselves. But some of the guys that they've been recruiting that are top 100 guys and top 200 guys and 4-star guys have not been selling themselves the last couple of years. And you can say some of that is coaching, but some of
So,
that is
but
also
wait,
just
selling
developmental.
themselves, selling themselves to who?
Just playing
Selling
well
themselves
enough.
to who? What do you
There were
mean by
players
selling
on.
themselves?
No, I mean just not playing well enough. Have not been making the case for themselves with their play.
Yeah, no, I know. In the end, it's like how good of a player are you? But I'm talking about the idea of guys coming in. Are you okay with the idea of Jim Knowles if he decided to? And I'm not saying he will decide to, but would you be comfortable with Ohio State going toward a more defensive fit style of recruiting and maybe winding up with and like, yeah, sometimes, I mean, not really. Darren Lee was in the 600s and Luke Fickle had to like wrestle Urban Meyer to the ground to get Urban Meyer to approve an offer to Darren Lee. And Darren Lee was down the road and he had to come to camp like 4 times. And it was like a huge deal. That would become the norm. Like if that became the
No,
norm, would you be
no,
okay with that? And do you think Ohio State fans would be okay with that?
no. I think it would have to be more selective than that. I don't think that would. I don't think
Okay.
the fan base, but I also think. I also just don't think that's the result. And I know that we're talking about he did get those results at Oklahoma State, but also the other factor at Oklahoma State was that you had a group that had built together for a long time. I mean, how many of those 2021 guys that he had on that defense that were all 3 stars had been playing together for like 3 years at that point were all seniors. I mean, Tanner McAllister left and came here after that year, but Rodriguez and a lot of other guys it was a group that had kind of grown together, and there's something to that, I think, sometimes. So that's another factor that can't be completely dismissed. I don't think though that this is the way. I don't think it's the way Jim Knowles actually wants to build though. I think Jim Knowles wants to get the best linebacker athlete in the country and get him to play as well as Malcolm Rodriguez played, as productively.
Yeah, it is interesting because just like Tommy Eichenberg is a really good example here. And it is a really that we sort of have it. We don't only have to theorize it from an Oklahoma State point of view, because Tommy Eichenberg is a very good player, but also did not look like this before and has been maximized. And, again, he's certainly not a guy who was in the 800s. He was in the 247 composite number 318 as a recruit, but he got it. Like, he got it very quickly. And we've already talked about that. So would you take 11 Tommy Eichenbergs? Like, would you from a skill standpoint? Because as good as Tommy Eichenberg is, I think we can acknowledge he's not the most naturally talented linebacker in the country. So it is an interesting way to think about it. But I do think it's not unreasonable, and I think it's Jim Knowles' goal, as you said. Well, just get 5-star players and have them get the defense like Tommy Eichenberg gets it, and then we're good to go. It's like, okay, but
But
that of course that's the goal. If you do that, you're the number one defense in the country. But if you're short of that, which way are you going to lean? Are you going to maybe lean toward? I just wonder if we could see a couple more, and you're saying maybe do it sporadically, just a couple more Jim Knowles guys in these defenses. And
well,
like Darren Lee, Darren Lee in the 600s, like Luke Fickell didn't get 10 of those a year. Like, you had to find the right guy and fight for him and explain why. And he's the last guy in the class, maybe that kind of thing. But it wasn't how they went about business on a regular basis.
But let's also be careful too, though, because you're changing the conversation slightly to where should Jim Knowles bring in linebackers like that, and should you try to build a whole defense out of them? I think that is a big jump too. We've talked before
No,
about the role of a linebacker in a defense
I'm
as
just
opposed.
using linebackers. I mean everybody. I mean everybody. I mean everybody.
I think
I
it's
just using linebacker because that's what we got on.
I think it's more likely that it could happen at linebacker than any other position, and not just because Jim Knowles is the coach there. I just think that you can look for a different profile of player there. But I think at edge rusher, at cornerback, at safety, I think you're still looking for, and maybe even safety. You could probably find guys. I think that's where you're maybe going to find maybe those. You're more likely to find a diamond in the rough like that. But I think at those other positions, you want to be recruiting elite athletic talent, superior talent, because the teams that you need to beat are also doing that.
Yeah, that's what I think too. But I think it's an interesting conversation around this idea and the right balance of it. Okay. When we come back, we'll get into some Marvin Harrison stuff, a little TV stuff, a little Ohio State future head coach stuff. We'll do all of that next on Buckeye Talk.